Hey guys, I'm Urizi. This story is all about what if Naruto was the owner of a cafe diner. Even the gods and goddesses of Olympus needed a day off. Sometimes they needed time away from the constant bickering and never-ending controversies of their family. On one such day, Wisdom and Moon found themselves discovering a hidden gem within the city that never sleeps, and meeting a familiar blonde knucklehead with a penchant for the color orange. Before we proceed with the story, please like and subscribe to this channel if you liked the video, and don't forget to check the description for the other works of the author if you liked the story. Let's start. Chapter 5, Part V. Dining with Divinity. The moment the bell rang, Naruto's face lit up as a familiar customer appeared before him. Well, if it isn't my favorite customer. The goddess of the moon blinked in surprise at the blonde's voice. After a long and tiring couple of days training the newest members of her hunt and running them through their first ever monster hunt with little sleep, Artemis decided she needed to slip away for an hour. As always, she left her faithful lieutenant, Zoe, to keep the girls in line until she returned and have the chores completed. The three new girls, Lucy, Tracy, and Eloise, showed promise, though it would be many years before they came close to acquiring the skill set her older hunters possessed. Hunters like Zoe, who had been part of the hunt for over 2,000 years, and Phoebe, a daughter of Apollo who joined before even Zoe, were two of a handful of young women who grew into elite warriors after spending centuries at her side. Like her aunt Hestia, Artemis often spent the time in a younger form. Most often it was in the form of a girl between the ages of 13 and 15, as many of her young companions tended to fluctuate between those ages. It was a method for her to bond with her hunters, particularly the younger ones who might find her adult form too intimidating and imposing. To make them feel more comfortable, she took on a form that helped them feel at ease. Most of her hunters had come to her to escape from the grasp of evil men and their dark thoughts and desires, which was why her group of maidens were women and women only. Though only a handful of men had ever earned a place in her hunt, it was exceptionally unlikely in this day and age. With some time to herself and Zoe running the hunt in her place, Artemis teleported to New York. Changing back into her adult form, and adopting modern clothing rather than her hunting gear, she headed straight for her favorite spot in the city. She sent a message to Athena and asked if her sister wished to join her, but the goddess of wisdom was currently engaged in a meeting with Hephaestus. For once, she was going it alone. "Good afternoon, Naruto." "Good afternoon." He handed her a menu and led her to a table near the counter. "It's been a little while since you last visited. I was beginning to wonder if I was ever going to see you again." One of his hands dug into his pockets. "Your sister not with you today. I've been busy of sorts these last few weeks. Out of state," she explained. "This is my first time back in the city in over a month." Her most recent hunts had taken her across the North American continent, hunting creatures and monsters big and small with the aid of her hunters. One of the aspects of hunting monsters she always found exhilarating was never knowing how long each hunt was going to take. Some hunts could take no longer than a couple of hours. Once, a hunt back in the 1400s took no longer than 5 minutes when they discovered the monster they were requested to track and destroy was no more than 300 yards up the dirt path from them. However, other times she participated in hunts that took years to complete. Though time-consuming, the feeling of ending a hunt after such a long period was one of the most gratifying feelings a huntress like herself could have, and no, my sister was unavailable. Though, I'm sure she will stop by for a visit soon. I see. Not to worry. I'll have to keep an eye out for her. He laughed. She always has the funniest reactions when she visits. Is it terrible of me to say it brightens my day when I catch her reactions from the corner of my eye? Artemis couldn't help but half grin at the statement. Truthfully, Athena's reactions during their visits tickled her funny bone as well. The first time with lemon curd still replayed over and over again in her mind, and while shocked the first time, now the Olympian found the scene hilarious. Athena had sworn her to secrecy over that incident, but it didn't mean she couldn't use it to tease the elder goddess. "No, it's not, though I wouldn't mention it to her," she advised, half serious and half in humor. "My sister isn't the type who handles being embarrassed very well. I would be careful, and not make your amusement too obvious." "Understood. I'll try and be discreet." He could do that. He was a ninja after all. Discreet was his middle name. See that you do. Looking around the room, she noticed she was the only customer and forced a frown to etch over her beautiful features. Where was everyone else? She thought business was booming. The last time she was here, she and Athena had been lucky to get a table. If they arrived even a minute later they would have been forced to leave disappointed. Where's all your customers? I thought the business was doing well. The idea that her favorite place wasn't getting the attention it deserved was ludicrous. A chuckle escaped Naruto, they were all here earlier. Her blank look coerced him to elaborate, it's Sunday and I close at 2 on Sundays. Remember? The goddess of the moon had let that piece of information slip her mind. I was moments away from closing up for the day before you came in. Artemis's eyes widened a fraction, how could I forget? She looked at the clock behind the counter and read 14:05. In her excitement, the Olympian forgot there was a 3-hour time difference between California and New York. How foolish of me! She fought the urge to face palm. Her excitement had gotten the better of her and the lack of sleep from the past couple of days was catching up with her. I'll go. My apologies for, she started to say, already on her feet when the blonde owner waved his hands in the air. Another chuckle escaped him. Don't worry about it. Sit down. Sit down. Are you sure? Artemis hated being needlessly in the way, as rare of an occurrence as it was. Very. Now sit and make yourself comfortable. He replied, his voice laced with confidence. If any other male had spoken to her like that then she would have turned his into a jackalope. However, since it was the blonde who she was developing more than a tolerance for, she would allow it. Though, he better not push his luck. She sat back down, her menu returning to her hands, very well, but only because you insisted. Inwardly, she let out a sigh of relief. She'd been looking forward to this all day. Her sweet tooth was craving for a slice of anything she could get her hands on. The stuff she ate with the hunt was decent, but it never left her fully satisfied, especially her need for sugary baked goods. Her hunters were novices at best when it came to cooking, despite trying in the past to have Hestia give them a few pointers. Smiling, he walked over to the door and switched the open sign to close. He didn't want any more walk-ins. So, what can I get you? He asked. He didn't bother with his notepad and pen. He already had an idea what the auburn-haired woman was going to order. Vice versa, Artemis looked at him with a blank look, while raising one of her eyebrows. Surely he wasn't serious? I'll take my usual, please. Salted caramel hot chocolate. Of course. And the cake? Carrot, please. 2 slices. Artemis even held up 2 fingers. His smile grew wider at the cheek. All right. I'll be with you shortly. He turned and prepared to move away, however, the goddess watched him halt mid-step. A thought crossed his mind that Naruto had been meaning to ask should he encounter her again. Can I ask you something? Artemis raised another eyebrow, as long as it's nothing personal. She liked the mortal, but she hoped he knew his boundaries. There was still time to turn him into a 4-legged critter. For his sake, he better not ask her on a date as previous foolish men tried. It didn't end well for them. To her surprise, Naruto caught on to her thoughts and shook his head. It's nothing like that. Cross my heart. He motioned a cross shape over his chest, it's something I've been wondering and meaning to ask you since your first visit. When Artemis motioned for him to continue, he asked his question, what's your name? Artemis blinked in surprise. That wasn't the question she was expecting, my name. The blonde nodded, yeah, your name. I've wanted to ask since you almost cleaned me out of carrot cake on your first visit. You and your sister have become regular faces around here, but I still don't know your name. I'd like to rectify that if you let me. His smile returned, and he gave a light shrug, you don't have to, but I wouldn't mind knowing the name of my favorite customer. The goddess hummed in thought. She sensed no ill will in his voice, and his posture was calm and relaxed. If he was up to something, he hid it well. Though some men were known to have the uncanny ability to hide their true selves behind a mask or facade of a false persona. However, the moon goddess liked to think she was a good judge of character, and thus far the blonde owner had yet to give her a reason to think he was up to no good. He didn't strike her as the type who would possess evil thoughts of that nature. So far, he had proven himself to be a decent man, whose primary concern was keeping his business running and showing kindness and good food to his customers. Leaning back in her chair, she gave a small nod. I don't see any harm in it. My name is Artemis. Naruto's smile widened, and let out a hum. Artemis. He repeated the name a couple of times. He liked the way it rolled off the tongue. That's a beautiful name. You're named after a goddess, you know. Artemis fought the urge to smirk. Instead, she wore a playful little smile that few male mortals got to see. I know. Since my family is Greek, they felt it was appropriate for me to have a Greek name. What could be better than being named after a goddess? Not much, I guess. He chuckled. Indeed. Do you know much about Greek mythology? It's not a subject people study much these days. It's a rare following. The blonde owner nodded. His hands rested on the chair in front of him. It just so happens I do. I learned a lot during my time in Greece, as I mentioned the day we met. It wasn't just the language and the food I studied but the whole mythos that surrounded ancient Greece. I visited a lot of the old sites like you would do in a country with such a rich history. He thought back to the days he traveled around, and thought back to one of his many visits to the old country. I visited the Acropolis in Athens, the ancient Delphi, Meteora, Epidaurus, ancient Olympia. Those are just a couple of places I had the pleasure of visiting. I can only imagine what they were like back in their day. Yes, I can imagine. The goddess replied, playing along. He ran a hand through his hair. You know, I went to what's left of the old temple of Artemis in Turkey a long time ago. He revealed, making Artemis look at him in interest. I'm not sure what I expected to find, but I couldn't help feeling disappointed when I saw all that was left was foundation and fragments. Looking up at the ceiling, he closed his eyes for a brief moment, remembering his time in Ephesus. I bet it was a thing of beauty back in the day. Oh, it was, and Artemis knew full well how majestic her old temple was. Back in ancient times, her temple was frequently visited by women and men of all ages, praying to her for several things that fell under her jurisdiction. The men would pray to her for successful and plentiful hunts while expecting mothers would pray for strength for the coming days that lay ahead of them. Her temple was one of the most iconic temples ever built on the earth, rivaled only by the Temple of Athena at the summit of the Acropolis and the Temple of Zeus at Olympia. However, twice her temple had to be rebuilt. The first time, a devastating flood reduced it to rubble, courtesy of Poseidon after one of his infamous temper tantrums. The god of the sea had been forced to pay a great tribute to her as compensation. The second time, a few centuries later, her temple was burned to the ground by that foolish mortal, Herostratus, who sought notoriety and fame. She couldn't lie and say she didn't take a small amount of pleasure in watching the foolish man from getting his just desserts during his execution. Although a modern model was built years later in Istanbul, she had only visited the site once. It didn't possess the same value as the old versions, and a rare handful of people prayed to her these days. While lost in her thoughts, the blonde disappeared behind the counter and got her order underway. You don't mind if I get things cleaned up after I finish your order, do you? She shook her head. Not at all. Fortunately for her, she didn't have to wait long before Artemis found herself sinking into the chair as the taste of her hot chocolate covered her lips. Releasing a small hum of delight, she moved on to her cake, and like always, felt her sweet tooth getting utterly satisfied as her immortal taste buds were showered with sugary bliss. How the mortal man did it, she didn't know, but she wished that she did. Artemis was a decent cook, given some lessons by her mother and Hestia, but had never made anything remotely as sweet and perfect as the meal in front of her. Was there a method to the man's madness? Was there someone helping him? She'd never seen another soul working the little cafe in the time she spent in its warm embrace. She remembered that he mentioned making from scratch many of the delightful goods himself, but when did he find the time to make them all? His menu was vast and unpredictable. It would take him all through the night to make it all. Not to mention, there was the issue of keeping it all fresh. It was a mystery, and part of the moon goddess wanted to solve it. Don't rock the boat, she thought to herself. She had a good thing going here. The fox's den was an escape. Somewhere she could get away for an hour or two. She and Athena had been the first to visit, and since then, more and more gods and immortals from their world were beginning to take notice. On the one hand, she wished the little cafe had been her secret with Athena which only they could enjoy. On the other hand, at least it was getting the business and fame it deserved. If it closed down, Artemis was sure she would weep for days. No more hot chocolate. No more cake. What a dark world that would be. From her seat, Artemis couldn't help but watch him as she sipped her drink. Without Athena to talk with, she had little else to do but watch the man at work. He has good balance, she mused, watching as he stacked one of his trays high with cups and plates, and balanced it on the tips of his fingers. For 10 minutes, Artemis sat and watched him moving around the room as if his body was on autopilot. As soon as one task was done, he was on to the next before she could blink. His rate of work is impressive. She mused, before inwardly frowning and rolling her eyes. Stop praising the man. Gods, what is wrong with me? A hand waved in front of her face, and Artemis found the blonde trying to catch her attention. A broom was in his hand, with a small pile of trash piled together next to him. Yes. Had he asked her something? She was so lost in her thoughts that she hadn't noticed. Did you need something? Nothing important, but I did want to ask you another question. Though, only if you don't mind your attention temporarily leaving your cake. Another question? How bold of him. I'll allow it. However, I expect another round of both. She pointed to her empty plate and cup as she chewed on the final piece of her meal. All in good time, he laughed and took her words in good humor. I asked, what do you do? What do I do? She repeated, a frown appearing at the words. What do you mean? I mean that you said you were out of the state, right? She nodded. Well, was that because of work? If it was, then I was asking, what do you do for a job? What's your profession? Oh. That's what he was asking. Her mouth began to move, yet before any words could come out her mind stepped in. What was she going to say? It wasn't like she going to spill the beans to him and tell him all the glorious details. There's a goddess in front of you, who just so happens to be the actual Artemis we were talking about earlier. Crazy, right? Yeah, no. It was rare for her to inform mortals, especially male mortals, of her true identity. As much as the blonde had grown on her, he still didn't need to know the nitty-gritty details. The only mortals she told were the girls who joined her hunt, demigods she happened to come across, and the few mortals that were clear-sighted and could see through the mist that wrapped around their world. The blonde was neither a woman nor was he a demigod, and Artemis was close to positive that he couldn't see through the mist. Therefore, her identity would remain a secret from him. Although maybe telling him he's serving a goddess would earn me a discount, she mused, though shook those thoughts away. She would tuck that question away for another time. I may. She paused for a moment, before settling on a story, guidance counselor. Really? Roll with it, she thought, before continuing, that's right. I specialize in helping young women, typically teenagers, and sometimes younger, that come from broken homes or have faced abuse in their past. That part wasn't made up. I have a group of girls that I take away on retreats, working with them out in the wilderness and teaching them how to survive in nature. We go camping, hiking, and I've even shown them how to hunt and gather their food. She heard him whistle, and stare at her with an impressed look. Wow. That's amazing. He grabbed a couple of napkins from the counter and handed them to the waiting hands of the goddess. How many do you work with? About 3 dozen. On your own? All on my own. My sister chips in from time to time, but most of the time it's just me. Her sister often pointed her in the direction of young women that required her aid. Some of Athena's past daughters were once members of the hunt, though none currently existed within the group. Does that surprise you? She watched and gauged his reaction, and felt a stroke of relief when he shook his head. It doesn't. To be honest, I am not surprised at all. She stared at him curiously. Oh? And why is that? His expression turned thoughtful. I'm not sure why and I can't explain it well, but when I saw you the first time you visited, I had this feeling in the pit of my stomach that you were someone who liked taking care of people. Oh. That surprised her to hear. She leaned forward, inwardly urging him to continue. She wanted to hear more. There's something about you that makes me believe you're someone who has seen bad things happen to people. Maybe you've had bad experiences in the past, or maybe you haven't. That's not my place to ask. He gave her a look, indicating he wasn't going to push that subject with her. Either way, you have this energy about you. It's comforting and warm, and I felt it the first day you walked through that door. He nodded over to the door, and smiled. I think you're someone who wants to shield people, in this case, young girls, and gives them something to strive for. You don't want them to lose themselves down a dark path because of the abuse they've suffered, so you take them into a safe environment and you teach them how to survive. You teach them how to be strong. He leaned on the broom, and his smile widened. I've met a lot of people, and I've met some who have done awful things to others. Going across the world opens up a box that can't ever be closed. Sadly, I've come to realize some people can only be described as awful, misguided and cruel. They inflict pain onto other people for reasons that make no sense. Women, in particular, tend to get the short end of the stick every time and end up suffering at the hands of both men and their fellow women. Whether it be physical abuse, mental abuse, or any kind of abuse for that matter, no one should have to go through those kinds of horrors. There was a brightness to his blue eyes when he looked at her, knowing that young women have someone like you in their corner, someone who fights for them and shows them kindness and a helping hand. It proves my assumption about you was correct. He went back to his cleaning, though not before saying, by the way, your meal's on the house today. Think of it as my way of saying thank you. Returning to his work, the face Artemis sent his way went unnoticed. The goddess of the moon could do little but stare silently at the blonde, her crumb-covered mouth partially open as she gawked at him. This mortal, this man, continued to baffle her. She was 4,593 years old, and she could say with all certainty, she had never been praised by a male mortal in such a way before. One that wasn't a demigod, or had any connection to their Olympian family. Even Zeus, who doted on her and Athena like they were still small goddesses he could pick up and lift onto his shoulders, had never praised her for her work in such form. It was always something regarding her skill as a warrior, and never as a nurturer. People forgot, and she included her family in that category, that she was more than just the goddess of the hunt and the moon. She was also the patron of young women and children and held divine authority over childbirth alongside her sister, Elytia, thanks in part for delivering her twin Apollo from their mother. She could be nurturing and loving. She didn't have children of her own out of choice early in her life, but she showed compassion and kindness to children of both genders regardless of the sins of the parents. Her hunters could attest to that. This man, he was confusing her. The first time they met and he surprised her behind the counter, she thought he was like all the rest. She thought he would be cocky, arrogant, or overconfident with his talents as a chef. The rest of the world would be if they possessed a tenth of his culinary talent. However, Artemis was pleased that she had listened to Athena and given him a chance to prove himself to be unlike the others. He was confident, but not overly so. He took compliments with grace and no shortage of embarrassment, and his sunny disposition and kindness had wormed its way into the good graces of many of her family members. He was a good one. Artemis had come to that realization. You don't have to do that, she replied. She watched him blink. I know I don't have to. He looked up from the floor, and smiled in her direction, but I want to. She was prepared to argue her point but stopped when he sent her a light scolding expression. Take the offer. I'm only offering it today. Use this chance wisely. There was a hint of a challenge in his tone. The goddess huffed and crossed her arms. Beneath the table, her foot tapped against the floor in mild annoyance. Fine then. If he was serious about her not paying, then she was going to take advantage of his kind offer. She hoped he was ready because her sweet tooth was already returning in force. His kindness would be his downfall because she planned on upping her appetite to the next level. Outside. Across the street from the fox's den, as the blonde shinobi and the goddess of the hunt conversed with each other, little did they know another Olympian was also in the neighborhood. This Olympian had been made a fool of by the blonde, and thanks to him became the butt of the joke by his family and came looking for revenge. He didn't know who it was, but someone had leaked to his Olympian family what had occurred that fateful day and he hadn't heard the end of it. Everyone, including his father, would snicker every time he walked into the room, and his brothers had become intolerable. Apollo and Ares were on his case every free moment he had, and it was making his itcher boil. Even Poseidon caught wind of it beneath the sea, and Iris messaged him for the sole purpose of pointing and laughing at him. He couldn't stand it. He was sure it wasn't Hestia. His lovable aunt would never betray him in such a form. Maybe it was the nymphs, but he doubted any were brave enough. Satyrs? No, not the satyrs. They would never betray him. No, he bet it was that demmed Terminus. That stupid border god loved to make his life miserable. Oh, when he was finished with the blonde, Terminus was next. That was for damn sure. I got you now, you conniving SOB, Hermes whispered, his blue eyes narrowing at his foe. Wrapped in the mist, he remained hidden and out of sight from his foe. Next to him, the dark-haired god patted his secret weapon that would even out the scales and delivers to him his sweet retribution. Like he promised to his aunt, he wasn't going to kill the mortal. However, that didn't mean he couldn't hurt the mortal. It wouldn't be too severe, but it would be funny. What was his weapon of choice? He could have gone with a couple of choices, however, his genius mind had settled on a Hephaestus-grade mashed potato cannon. It had taken some bribing since his elder brother didn't do anything for free, and a great amount of patience, but he finally convinced the god of the forge to go through with his request. Modeled after one of the old 24-pounder long guns used by the world's navies between the 17th and 19th centuries, the only difference between his one and the old models was that his shot out mashed potato at a frightening speed and was capable of shooting through a tree. He tested it once the other day, and it was safe to say, Ares had not been too happy at being his test dummy. The god of war had been exiting his temple when he was hit by a condensed shot of mashed potato and was sent sprawling through his home yelling and cursing. He hadn't realized Aphrodite had been visiting, and the lump he called his brother had landed on top of her, covering her in mashed potato and ruining her dress. The goddess of love had given him an earful later on, but it was worth it. All he had to do now was catch Naruto at the right moment and lay him out with his glorious cannon. There was only one issue with his plan, and it was one he hadn't been counting on. Hermes had hoped the blonde would be alone to avoid additional casualties. He didn't think Artemis of all people would be there at this exact moment. However, as unwise as it was with the goddess of the moon present, Hermes would carry on undeterred. His schedule over the next month was hectic, and that was putting it mildly. It was now or never, even if it meant upsetting his dangerous and temperamental older sister. Come on Hermes, you beautiful man. You got this. He repeated to himself, psyching himself up. Naruto whistled, boy, you sure showed me. Staring at the plates and cups that were piled high around her table, the blonde couldn't do anything but admire the auburn-haired woman's determination and seemingly bottomless pit she called a stomach. It reminded him of himself. You know, I wonder if that's some kind of new record. Maybe I should have your face framed and put on display on the back wall for all to see. Wiping her face with the napkins provided, the happy expression plastered on her face bordered on smugness. She wasn't sure how long it had been since she'd self-indulged to such a degree, but it was hard to care about such thoughts when she felt so pleasantly full. Her appetite was something of infamy on Olympus, and despite being notably smaller than her divine brothers, and some of her sisters, Artemis could outlast all of them when it came to food. Most of the time she could restrain herself, but being told everything was on the house for one day only, restraint had gone out of the window. How gluttony wasn't one of her domains still mystified her. I'd ask where it all goes, but I know questions like that could get me in trouble with women. Artemis snorted, smart man. It's nice to see a man with a brain for once. Naruto bowed in response. I suppose I should leave you be, and let you go home. I've been here an hour longer than I intended. She needed to get back to her hunters. Zoe, in particular, would be wondering where she had gotten to. Thank you for your time and patience, and thank you for staying open longer for me. The gesture is appreciated. Hopefully, I'll be able to come back sooner. She stood from the table and dusted off the crumbs from her shirt. I look forward to it, Naruto replied, looking at the high pile of plates and cups. He was never more thankful for his dishwasher than he was right now. Despite being kept longer at the fox's den than he'd hoped, he found himself enjoying the small talk that began between himself and Artemis. They went back and forth on whatever crossed their minds, and he found himself enjoying her company. It was nice talking to someone who wasn't one of his clones. Artemis had the same thoughts, though wouldn't admit it out loud. The mortal man was, all right in her books. An idea popped into his head, and he motioned for Artemis to wait for a moment. Watching him disappear, Artemis stood by the counter, watching the door that led to the kitchen and listening to the movements and mutterings of the blonde. What in the world is he doing? She wondered. When a minute passed, she was about to head towards the door when Naruto came waltzing out, pushing the door open with his left leg and carrying 2 large white paper boxes in his arms. What's this? Just something from me to you, he replied. You said you see your group regularly. Next time you see them, treat them to what's in the boxes. He smiled and lifted one of the lids, revealing the inside of the box. The inside was littered with goodies that would have made Artemis salivate with greed. Dozens of cookies were piled high on each other, with gooey chocolate on the inside. The smell made Artemis close her eyes, taking in the scent. Maybe she could make some room in her stomach after all. The other one has lemon squares. There should be enough for everyone to have a couple each. This is very kind of you. You don't have to do this. She watched him turn to look at her, blue meeting silver. She knew his eyes were blue, but she never noticed how blue they were. They were more vibrant than Apollo's, and even her father's. Like I said earlier. I know I don't have to, but I want to. His smile widened, and shrugged. Maybe, if you and your group are ever in the neighborhood, you could come and visit. I'll treat them all to hot chocolates and cakes. Closing the lid shut, Artemis placed one box on top of the other and lifted them into her arms. That wasn't a bad idea. She had a feeling her hunters would come to like this place as well if given the chance to visit. Sure. That would be nice. His face brightened. Then, until next time. Until next time. She replied, and starting moving, could you get the door for me? My hands are a little full at the moment. Sure. He wandered over and pulled the door open, bowing low in an overdramatic fashion. The action was enough to make her snort, though in amusement rather than annoyance. Thank you. Taking one last look at the blonde, her face frowned when she looked down at his shoes, pointing out, your shoelaces are untied. Huh. Blinking, he looked down and saw she was right. So they are. Thanks. Crouching down to tie his laces, Naruto was none the wiser when out of nowhere, a loud bang erupted in the air and he felt something whiz past the top of his head at tremendous speeds, grazing the tips of his hair. He almost jumped up in surprise and felt something splash against his cheek as a thud followed after. He spun around, noticing none of the people out in the street appeared bothered by the loud noise, and searched the pavement for anything that could have resulted in such a loud noise. What the hell was that? He thought. For a moment, he thought he saw movement in the alleyway opposite the fox's den. He could sense something across the street, but whatever it was masking its presence and trying to keep itself hidden. It felt familiar, but he couldn't put his finger on it. Touching his cheek, he wiped off the residue from whatever splashed against him. He stared at it for a couple of seconds before realization hit him. Is this mashed potato? Why in the world was mashed potato flying through the air? Hey, do you know dash, he started to say, but his words died in his mouth when he got a look at Artemis. Oh boy. To say Artemis had been unlucky would be an understatement. The goddess of the moon and the hunt, who moments ago was happier and more content than she had been in months, was now on the other side of the room with her back resting against the wall of the fox's den, cracks covering the wall like a spider's web. The impact of the mashed potato from across the street had caught her unguarded, and tossed her through the air and into a sitting position, her legs out in front of her and arms wrapped around the cake boxes in a vice-like grip. Her body was covered with mashed potato from head to toe, with large clumps of it wrangled in her hair and up her nose. Naruto couldn't say a word and watched as the realization of what happened slowly dawned on Artemis. Her face, once wearing an amused smile, quickly morphed into one of pure fury that Naruto wouldn't wish on his worst enemy. He let out a gulp and got to his feet. Reaching behind the counter, he pulled out a towel and wordlessly handed it to Artemis, who took the towel and wiped the vegetable residue off her face. Her silver eyes zeroed in on the alleyway, like a lion who found its prey and got to her feet. She turned her attention to the gobsmacked Naruto and handed back the towel, which he gingerly accepted. "Thank you. If you would excuse me. It appears I need to make a trip home, and..." She trailed off mid-sentence, her rage consuming her body. The blonde could do little more than nod his head as the auburn-haired goddess left the fox's den, cold fury taking over her entire person. He idly noticed her make a motion to her neck, dragging a finger across the jugular before disappearing from view. Turning around and now on his own, Naruto sighed when he noticed it wasn't just Artemis that was covered in mashed potato, but now potato was strewn across the inside of the den on every side. "I just want to go home," he muttered, before beginning his cleanup again. "Run, Hermes. Run as you've never run before," Hermes muttered to himself, running across Olympus and leaving a trail behind him as fear encased his entire being. That damn blonde. Why did he have to duck at that exact moment? Running across his ancestral home, the god of messengers thought about his options. The mortal realm was out of the question. Artemis would find him in a heartbeat. His temple was out of the question, and the unsaid rule about gods not barging into others' temples would go widely unnoticed in this situation. He doubted his sister cared for that rule with all that rage coursing through her. He ran through his options. Apollo isn't here, nor is Ares. Dionysus is at Camp Half-Blood, and Hephaestus has locked himself in his forge again. His brothers wouldn't be of any use. Apollo, in particular, had a weak spot for his twin, and would likely give him up rather than help him. And Hestia, Demeter, and Hera are visiting grandmother, so who knows where they might be. Their grandmother came and went from Olympus when she pleased and became increasingly difficult to track. Her residence, a pottery studio she started a decade ago, had a habit of shifting and alternating its location. There was Athena to turn to, but Hermes shook that out of his thoughts. Athena and Artemis were close, and his elder sister would likely conspire with Artemis to have him tortured if given the chance. She still hadn't forgiven him for painting one side of her temple pink while she was visiting the mortal world. Gulping, his choices were running low. Poseidon and Hades would turn him away, the latter in particular. Though he could beneath the sea and the underworld, he wasn't supposed to abuse that privilege given to him by his uncles. Angering the gods of the sea and the underworld was not on his to-do list. One man-hating goddess was enough. Biting the bullet, Hermes changed course and made a beeline for the grand temple made of white marble that stood closest to the throne room of the gods. Hopefully, his old man wouldn't be bothered too much by the sudden intrusion. Hermes. His face going pale, Hermes bolted towards his father's temple, his sister's voice ringing throughout Olympus. Her godly energy fluctuated in bursts and was likely sensed by all currently residing on Olympus. It was potent enough that Hermes could practically feel her rage. "Oh, man. She is so pissed," he muttered, narrowly avoiding colliding with a pair of nymphs, and shouting an apology as he ran past them. In mere seconds, Hermes found himself pushing open the enormous golden doors of his father's temple and ran inside, slamming it shut behind him. The inside of Zeus's temple was exactly how one would imagine it to be. It was large and spacious, and everything was made of marble. Personally, Hermes preferred hardwood flooring and found marble floor much too slippery for his liking, but he wasn't about to doubt his father's taste in decoration. A grand staircase left up to the second floor, where the master suite resided, along with a long hallway that contained many of his father's trophies and statues depicting his greatest triumphs. If that wasn't enough, a large statue of Zeus stood in the center of the temple, reaching the height of the roof and seen by all on every floor. Catching his breath, the sound of a TV reached his ears and Hermes noticed the faint glow coming from one of the back rooms. It looked like it was coming from his father's theater room. His father was a massive movie buff and had a thing for romantic comedies, not that many knew of course. Probably looking for the next Hollywood starlet to seduce, Hermes thought, before making a beeline for the room. His father loved celebrities almost as much as Aphrodite. As he expected when he appeared in the doorway, he spotted his father sitting in a comfortable black leather recliner with gold stitching. Zeus's theater room was giant, even by normal standards, and designed in the same manner as a mortal theater, with Zeus's favorite movie posters decorating the walls. Godfather, in particular, was his father's favorite movie of all time, and Hermes had caught the king of Olympus reciting quotes from the movie as if they were Shakespeare. Shelves were filled to the brim with DVDs, VHS tapes and old movie reels. Off to the side was a confectionery stand that was always stacked full of Zeus's favorite movie-going treats. He even had a slushy machine with over a dozen different flavors constantly churning away. Wearing his usual suit with lightning dancing across the fabric, the imposing aura his father tried to induce was given away by the pair of fuzzy white slippers his feet were clad in. They'd been a gift from Hestia a few years ago, and the god of the sky was rarely seen without them when roaming his temple. Hera had tried to get him to wear something different when they spending time together smoozing in one of their temples, though she had yet to succeed. Storming into the room, he looked around and quickly searched for the best hiding spot. In this case, he chose to hide behind the enormous golden curtains that covered his father's screen when it wasn't being used. It was big enough for a human body to hide without notice. The god of the sky and king of the gods blinked in surprise, a handful of buttery popcorn in his hands and flecked across his beard. Gathering his bearings, his face turned into a scowl, and a thrum of his immense power washed over the room, followed by the smell of the ozone. Hermes. What do you think you're doing? He paused the movie, with the image of Bobby Boucher about to football tackle a teacher frozen on the screen. Zeus loved Adam Sandler, but that was neither here nor there. Sorry, Dad. The younger god slipped behind the curtain, and Zeus felt his son's godly energy vanish. I'll make it up to you, I swear. Just don't let Artemis find me. A grunt escaped Zeus's body. What did you do, you idiot? Behind the curtain, Hermes was about to explain the situation to his father, hoping he could understand his plight. Though Zeus was a squishy marshmallow when it came to his immortal daughters, Artemis and Athena in particular, he could only hope his father would back him up on this one. Zeus practically invented the bro code after all. However, before Hermes could utter a word, the sounds of Zeus's temple doors creaked open, forcing Hermes to become as silent and still as a statue. Turning to the doorway, Zeus watched as his youngest Olympian daughter walked through the door, and was quick to notice the substance covering her body. Potato. He thought before his mind went to work and put the pieces of the puzzle together. He snorted and rolled his eyes, all the while shaking his head. His sons seemed to forget how formidable their Olympian sisters could be. Walking into the room with her hands clenched into fists, the goddess of the moon flittered across the room as silent as a deer, her eyes working 1,000 miles an hour as she searched every nook and cranny within Zeus's theater room. Father, she greeted, leaning over and placing a delicate kiss on her father's cheek. Her eyes never left the movie screen, and Zeus watched as her eyes searched the curtain on the left side, before settling on the one on the right. Her eyes narrowed, and Zeus watched in mild amusement as his son's hiding spot was compromised. Artemis stepped forward with an expression that promised a great deal of pain when Zeus called out to her, "Moonflower." She turned and stared at the king of the gods. If it was anyone else calling her that name, Artemis would have wrapped her bow around their head. It was a pet name she earned when she first visited Olympus. Only her father, and her mother, Leto, were allowed to call her that. Even Apollo would find his head buried in the earth if the name found its way escaping from his lips. Yes, Papa. Zeus had half a mind to chuckle when he heard the name. She only called him that when she wanted something, or when she needed to get away with something. Take it outside. Angry as she might be, he had no desire to watch his temple get turned inside out by his two children. Fine. Her words came out as a grumble, but the attitude disappeared the moment her eyes returned to the curtains. Before Zeus could blink, he watched as Artemis bolted forward, and dived behind the curtain. Silence reigned for no longer than a second before the wails of his son rang through his temple, forcing the king to shake his head as Artemis dragged Hermes out from behind the curtain, his head locked in her arms in an uncomfortable-looking headlock. His son tried to fight out of it, his arms swinging wildly in the air, but Artemis avoided every swing. The god of messages tried to look up at his sister. It was an accident. I swear. I was meant to get the barista. His words had the opposite effect he was hoping for. Artemis didn't say anything, and instead tightened the hold she had around his head. If he wasn't a god, then Hermes's head would have popped off like a champagne cork. Dad. Get Mimi out of this. Hermes chalked out before his sister's free fist came crashing down on the top of his head. A look of sadistic delight washed over her face, pulling the flailing Hermes out of Zeus's theater room and out of the temple. "You brought this on yourself, Hermes," Zeus grumbled, before unfreezing the movie. He knew his daughter's temper was almost as bad as his, though hopefully, she could restrain herself from taking it too far. "Chin up. Not that face. Please, not the Deshe." Squelch followed by a cry of agony, making Zeus wince as the door to his temple slammed shut. Shaking his head, he ignored the commotion happening outside, and leaned back in his recliner, digging back into his buttery popcorn. A bark of laughter soon escaped his mouth. "Ha! This movie kills me every time." Chapter 6, Part VL. Dining with Divinity. The blue eyes belonging to Naruto Uzumaki snapped open with the shinobi bursting up from his bed. His breathing was deep and ragged, with a sheen of sweat covering his forehead. Around the crew neck of his white t-shirt, drips of sweat darkened the fabric and stuck to the skin beneath. His body shook as his left hand came up and gently patted his chest, trying to regain control over his breathing. He crouched to one knee next to the bed, his free hand running his palm across the smooth fabric of the bedsheets as he felt the adrenaline begin to leave his body. After a couple of minutes, he changed his position and sat with his back resting against the bed. His head leaned back, staring up at the ceiling while he switched his bedside lamp on. Next to the lamp sat his alarm clock, displaying the time, 4:01 a.m. He still had an hour before he needed to get up, but something told him he wouldn't be falling back to sleep. What the hell was that? His dream, or nightmare, whichever he wanted to refer to it as, had been so vivid. Sometimes when people dreamed, their bodies switched to a kind of autopilot and went through the motions of the story that was playing out. Other times, they would watch themselves in the third person, watching the choices they were making. It was like a cinematic dream, and the person was watching a movie play out in their mind. This one, however, was a lucid dream, and Naruto was in control of his every action. He didn't dream often, but when he did his mind got creative. Hinata. Of course, the dream was about Hinata. His late wife had been on his mind for weeks now, ever since the Underhills visited the Fox's Den for their Valentine's Day. At first, it was random thoughts popping into his mind here and there. He'd been eating a bowl of ramen in his living room when his thoughts turned to the evening Hinata outclassed himself and Koji to become the undisputed ramen-eating champion of Isiraka Ramen. To this day, he didn't know how she did it, or where all that ramen went. Other times he thought about their afternoons together in their garden after he made himself some tea. Hinata was a master when it came to brewing tea and tea ceremonies. She taught him everything she knew about brewing tea leaves and getting the taste just right. Most mornings, when he woke up, his hand instinctively reached out to what would have been Hinata's side of the bed, wanting to feel her warm body beneath his fingertips. Now, it was just the cool surface of the sheets. In the dream, it felt so real. Hinata had been right in front of him, barely a meter away and in touching distance from his hands. She looked as she did when Bold started attending the Ninja Academy, with her lavender jumper and her hair falling just above her shoulders. She was as beautiful as he remembered and called out to her, but his voice was unnaturally silent. He took a step forward, and Hinata was pushed back a step. This went on for what felt like an eternity as the distance between them remained the same. They were so close, and yet she was a fingertip away. He started running, his arms stretched out as far as they would go, but still, he couldn't reach her. Then the ground started to shake. No. Her face became a picture of terror, her eyes as wide as the moon as the ground beneath her feet became less solid and stable. Dirt began to rise as Hinata started to sink into the earth, reaching her shins in a matter of seconds. Naruto's actions became more frenzied, and his voice, despite being silent, became raw as he wore out his throat muscles from his voiceless shouts. In a matter of moments, he was forced to watch as the dirt reached her neck, her body disappearing beneath the ground as her pale eyes looked at him for help. "Don't take her from me." His thoughts went unanswered, watching as the face of his wife disappeared entirely, the earth swallowing her body to make it look as if Hinata had never existed at all. Falling to the ground, the sobbing blonde couldn't do anything as he brought down his fist repeatedly against the ground, try as he might into forcing it to give his wife back. Each hit fell more silent after the other, until he was little more than a sobbing mess, his face covered in a mixture of dirt, snot, and tears. "Give her back." The ground shook again, and he felt the earth beneath his body begin to ripple and move around. Jumping up from the ground, he paced backwards a couple of steps and watched with pained eyes as the dirt began taking the shape of a feminine face. The eyes, the nose, and mouth all took shape, with the face being as large as king-size mattress. The mouth parted, spitting up dirt and rocks into the air while her eyes burst open with eyes a mixture of moss and coal. Just looking at the face made him fearful and angry at the same time as his hands clenched into tightly bound fists. "You!" He remembered roaring, his voice returning to him at last, "Haven't you done enough?" All he got back was a peal of laughter reminiscent of two stones grating against each other. The eyes looked at him through the laughter, the moss growing a brighter shade of green. The laughter went on and on until finally, his rage got the better of him as a Rasengan formed in his hand. It grew to the size of a basketball initially, before continuing to grow until it was the size of a small car. Throwing his arm forward, the A-ranked jutsu collided with the face, destroying its shape and kicking up an explosion, though the laughter continued until it became more a heckle. The next thing he knew, he was awake and jumping to his feet. Surveying the room after his not-so-pleasant dream, he winced when he noticed the spider-web cracks that now decorated his bedroom. He hadn't realized until now that his chakra must have been leaking while he was dreaming, causing the room to shift as it took a turn for the worst. He was going to need to fix that at some point. "Well, I doubt I'm going back to sleep now," he muttered, mentally telling himself to add it to the list of things he needed to do around the house. The house he bought was a bit of fixer-upper and hadn't been well maintained by the previous owner. Slowly, he'd been going around the old red brick Greek townhouse and turning into a home to be proud of. He didn't like all the new builds you saw walking the streets of New York. He'd grown to appreciate the buildings with a bit of history. The ones with a story to it. This one, in particular, dated back to 1846. Throwing his sleep clothes to the bed and making his way to the bathroom, he soon found himself sighing in relief as the hot water of his shower doused his body. He felt his stiff joints begin waking up from their dormant state. "I hope today's a quiet day," he thought, before humming and reaching for the shampoo. For many across the world, New York City was a playground for the wealthy and the beautiful. Any given sidewalk was full of men and women who were more beautiful than the last and wasn't afraid to show off that great beauty. As one of the world's leading hubs in fashion and beauty cosmetics, mortals from all over the world would flock to grab a piece of the fame that came with being beautiful. Often enough, people would stop and stare at a beautiful woman or a handsome man as they walked past, their desire reaching the surface, while their minds reminded them it would never be. Sometimes when a celebrity of notable fame was passing through, people would flock to them like a pack of rabid dogs. In this case, the entire sidewalk, as well as the sidewalk across the road, had stopped dead in their tracks. Waves of desire hit the mortals like they were being thrown into a head-on collision with a truck as their eyes followed the most beautiful woman and the most handsome man they had ever seen. With a skip in her step, Aphrodite soaked up the attention sent her way like a sponge soaking up water. Dressed in form-hugging jeans and cream-colored top, her heels clicked along the pavement as she sent a cheeky wink in the direction of a group of men who were too busy falling over themselves to care how stupid they looked. "I think today's going to be a wonderful day," Aphrodite giggled, watching as a man across the street walked into a streetlight, while an older gentleman was being glared at by his wife as his hands roamed over his chest. The glare didn't last long as the woman soon became transfixed by the man that walked a step behind Aphrodite. His hands were tucked into his jeans, his long blonde hair tied back in a man bun and a pair of sunglasses resting on his head. His upper half was covered in nothing but a form-fitting sleeveless white t-shirt, showing off his muscled and bronzed physique and arms that left the mortals a puddle of goo. To a mortal, it looked as if the man had stepped out of Baywatch. His shining eyes held the same joy for life that the love goddess possessed, scanning over both the men and women he passed by. His smile figuratively and literally brightened up the sky, as clouds parted to make way for the beautiful golden rays of the sun. When Aphrodite came barging into his golden temple on Olympus, the god of the sun didn't need convincing to spend the afternoon with her. Apollo determined from the first day he met the love goddess, life would never get boring on Olympus with Aphrodite around. When the twins of Zeus and Leto arrived together on Olympus, Aphrodite initially had gone to Artemis, trying to woo her with her silver tongue and mold the younger Olympian into another version of herself. Unfortunately for her, she arrived on Olympus not long before they did, but the whispers and rumors about Aphrodite's promiscuous nature had already woven its way into Artemis's ears. The goddess of the moon was quick to keep her at a distance. Instead, she chose to side with Athena, and the goddess of wisdom had been delighted to take her little sister under her wing and show her the ropes around their godly home. Though disappointed, Aphrodite instead turned her attention to the younger of the twins and was quick to snatch the young god into her claws. Showing off her immense beauty to the young Olympian, along with Apollo inheriting his father's lust for anything with two legs, it didn't take long for the god of the sun to become Olympus's biggest playboy. She and Apollo were like two peas in a pod, as the mortals would say, and she could say he was the god she got along with the most, minus Ares and Hestia. Granted, their relationship did strain for a while due to the whole business between Apollo and Eros, but that was all in the past. These days, when she needed a good night out, or to endlessly gossip about the handsome men and beautiful women she'd brought to her bed, Apollo was her go-to guy. "Deity, how much further is this place?" "Not long, my dear Apollo. Not long," she said, and noticed his pouty face staring back at her. "What's the matter? You're not still mad, are you?" "Yes, I'm still mad." He waved his hands in the air like a hot-tempered child, breaking the aura of smooth and handsome he loved to expel so much. "Why didn't you bring me with you when you, Athena and Arti went to this place?" "I had to hear about it from Hermes. And he heard about it from Ares, who heard about it from Dad. I wanted to go too. Honey, it was impromptu and it was a girl's day. You are not a girl, and you weren't around. What was I supposed to do?" "You could have Iris messaged," he mumbled, kicking an empty can to the side of the sidewalk. Looping her arms through his, Aphrodite giggled and patted his cheek. Around them, the male mortals were wishing they were Apollo, while the women wished they were the ones holding onto his bicep. "I'm very sorry for not including you. Next time, I'll make sure to send you an Iris message." She squeezed his bicep. "Forgive me." She leaned up and kissed him on the cheek, causing the mortals to nearly combust. His shining blue eyes took one look at her quivering lip before his attitude did a 180. "I can't stay mad at you, Deity. At least, not for long anyway." His attention turned back to the sidewalk, his negative feelings disappearing like they were never there to start with. That was their relationship to a T. One moment one could be mad at the other, and the next, they were best friends again. "Man, I'm excited. Is this place as good as they say it is? I know nymphs and satyrs tend to exaggerate, but I haven't heard a negative thing from anyone." Aphrodite tried not to grin. "Apollo, trust me when I say it will blow your expectations out of the water. It's that good. It's that good. I Frenched the owner in front of everyone when he gave me the most delicious entramet of my life." Even after all the time that passed, Aphrodite could still taste the apple spice on her lips, driving her taste buds wild with desire. Her smile turned coy. "I heard Artemis has even been visiting him on her own in her downtime." Apollo gasped at his Olympian bestie. "No way. Way, honey. Very way. But Lil Sis doesn't like anyone. She doesn't even like me on most days." Apollo could think back to all the times he tried to get his sister to come around and lessen her hate towards men, and each time it blew up in his face like a bolt of lightning to the crotch. To think, some no-name guy mortal with a talent for making good food and coffees could earn his sister's respect and, dare he say, affection. This guy must have been the real deal. His eyes narrowed, and a pout wove onto his face. This guy better not be trying to put the moves on my lil sis. Oblivious to Apollo's thoughts, Aphrodite's smile could melt the iciest of hearts. I know, which makes him all the more incredible. They rounded the corner of the street and the familiar orange frame of the fox's den came into view. Smiling with glee, Aphrodite pulled Apollo harder, nearly causing the sun god to trip over his own feet. There it is. It was hard for him to miss. Wow, that's a bright-looking building. It's almost as bright as my temple. Avoiding the mortals that were gaping at them, it didn't take long before the goddess of love was pushing the door open, and the familiar rich smell of coffee and pastries assaulted her senses. She sighed in pure delight, as the warmth tickled her skin. It was just how she remembered from her last visit. The room was half filled, mostly by pairs and couples, though a table consisting of a nymph and a satyr stuck out to the pair off in the back. Nothing had changed, and Aphrodite was glad. Prying Aphrodite's hands off his arm, Apollo was quick to fall into a similar state as his immortal relative. Taking one long whiff of the delightful aroma, Apollo visibly relaxed. "It smells amazing." For a first impression, Apollo was impressed. The fox's den looked like a place he could frequent. Eyes scanning the room, his gaze was quick to settle on the beautiful nymph dining with the satyr. Whoa! Look at that hottie. Long dark hair and magenta eyes, he couldn't help but lick his lips at the curves she was sporting. "I call dibs." Aphrodite shrugged, her colorful eyes scanning the room for her prey. "You can have her. I'm here for a much bigger fish." It only took a moment before the goddess of love found her target, who had his back to her and was in the middle of taking an order from a couple sitting in one of the middle tables. Tilting her head, it was Aphrodite's turn to lick her lips, her eyes staring at Naruto's ass. Mama likes. Apollo was quick to notice him. "So that's the guy?" he asked, looking Naruto up and down. "Tall? Check. Tanned? Check. Blonde? Check. Great physique if the clothes are to go by? Check. Handsome? Must be if you like him." Apollo went silent for a moment, tapping the side of his chin with his finger, before asking, "Share him with me?" "Nope." Aphrodite shook her head vehemently. "He's all mine. Find your own handsome man. Besides, I don't think he swings that way." Shrugging, Apollo turned his focus back on the nymph, who was now eyeing him curiously from the back of the room. A grin appeared on his face and sent a wink her way. "Gotcha," he thought, as he watched begin to giggle. The satyr could only groan. Ignoring Apollo, Aphrodite decided to make herself known to the blonde and silent skipped across the room. Years of practice in high heels had paid off as each step was as silent as a feline, her body weaving through the tables and chairs like a snake in the grass. Ignoring the looks from the mortals, Aphrodite found herself a step away from the den's owner as he finished jotting down the last of the orders. Reaching up with her hand, her fingers delicately traced along his shoulders. "Hi there, hand wah." The goddess of love couldn't do anything but let out a screech as she found herself being caught by the arm and thrown unceremoniously over the shoulder of her hunky target, her body going slack when it hit the ground with her long hair splayed out around her. Her eyes were wide while her body was spread out like an eagle, somehow narrowly avoiding colliding with one of the nearby tables, though her limbs were grazing a couple of legs of some chairs. Back with Apollo, the god of the sun could only gape as he watched an Olympian just get judo thrown by a mortal. If Artemis was here, she'd be rolling on the floor laughing. While Aphrodite looked up in silent shock as she regained her bearings, a stunned Naruto had frozen on the spot. His mouth was in the shape of an O, as he looked down at the beautiful woman he'd just assaulted by mistake. Oh God! He hadn't sensed her coming, nor did he sense the friend she brought with her. He hadn't been paying attention and somehow allowed this woman to sneak upon him. He hadn't meant to throw her over his shoulder. He just reacted. He'd been sluggish all day, the nightmare from earlier that morning playing over and over again in his thoughts since he left home that morning. He'd made a couple of mistakes that morning, and now he'd made the biggest mistake since he opened. Ow, handsome. What was that for? Aphrodite whined, propping herself up on her elbows and wore a pout. I was just coming to say hello. Shaking out of his thoughts, Naruto quickly crouched down and took her hands into his own, his worry for his customer overriding his nightmare. I am so sorry. I don't know what came over me. Are you okay? He checked her over, his hands and eyes roaming over her body like a doctor in an emergency room. You didn't hit your head or anything, did you? Around the room, he could hear his customers murmuring to themselves, making the blonde shinobi gulp. This wasn't good. To his relief, a giggle from the love goddess stopped the murmurs. Still propped up on her elbows, Aphrodite had to admit, while this wasn't exactly what she had planned, feeling his hand roaming her body checking for injuries was a good substitution. Lifting a hand, Naruto was quick to take it and pull her back to her feet. You're lucky you're handsome, otherwise, I'd slap you silly. You don't throw a girl over your shoulder, you know. Quickly fixing her hair, Aphrodite then added, don't worry though. I'm sturdier than I look. Thank goodness. He sighed. Someone with her power wouldn't have been hurt that easily, at least, he hoped not. Getting a good look at him, Aphrodite noticed the dark shade underneath his eyes. You look tired, honey. Have you not been sleeping? No wonder he was so jumpy. Throwing up his hands, Aphrodite allowed him to gently guide her over to a nearby table by the window. Don't worry about me. Come on, I'll show you to a table. Everything is on the house today after that incident. Ah, thank you, handsome. That's nice of you. Taking her seat, she ushered for Apollo to take the seat in front of her, distracting him as he silently mouthed something to the nymph. Once he strode over, he extended his hand to his fellow blonde, who gathered a pair of menus for them. Hey. The name's Apollo. Nice to meet you. Hi, I'm Naruto. Naruto replied, scratching the back of his head, sorry about what I just did to your friend. It's cool. As Dai said, she's tougher than she looks. If she can handle dating someone like my older brother, then she can handle just about anyone. Not to mention, she's survived scrapes with my sister, which is no easy feat. Apollo replied, noting the strong grip from his fellow blonde and the callus on his skin. He must have been a hard worker to attain such hands. Naruto? That sounds Japanese, right? Man, I haven't been to Japan for a long time. That's right. You don't look Japanese. I get that a lot. Parents with the flair for exotic names. Listening to Apollo hum, Naruto turned back to Aphrodite, noting what his fellow blonde mentioned. You're in a relationship? He asked, before adding, you weren't with someone when you kissed me, were you? Sending a glare to her Olympian bestie, the love goddess rested her head in the palm of her hand, her ankles crossing beneath the table. Don't worry, honey. I guess you could say my relationship status is always open. I'm not the type to get tied down. Just to have fun and see where the breeze takes me, if you know what I mean. She winked and giggled as his nervous laugh. Don't be uptight about such things. It's perfectly natural. Right, right. I guess that's true. Still giggling, Aphrodite opened up her menu. How about some milkshakes to start? I'll take a strawberry one, and Apollo will take chocolate. I want it just like you made it the last time I was here. Smiling and getting over his earlier embarrassment, Naruto gave them a nod. Sure. Think about what else you'd like, and I'll take some orders down when I come back with your drinks. Perfect. When he walked away, her foot was quick to kick Apollo's shin, forcing the sun god to wince. Ow. What was that for? What did I do? She leveled him with another glare. What did he do? How was it not obvious? Why in Hades' name did you mention my relationship with Ares? I'm trying to get this guy into my bed and have my way with him. By telling him about Ares, Apollo potentially just made it more difficult for her seductions to work. I swear, Apollo, if you do something to get in my way of that hunky man, I'll curse you to have the hots for Artemis. That very threat was the worst nightmare of Apollo and his twin, and the sun god couldn't help but squirm in his seat. You wouldn't. You bet I would. That's disgusting. He shook his head from side to side. Don't ever say those words again. Then keep this shut when it comes to my past lovers and exploits. She made a zip motion with her mouth and tossed it over her shoulder. Capic. Gulping, Apollo nodded like a madman. He was staying on his female bestie's good side. She could be more frightening than Zeus if given the chance. The pair sat in silence for a couple of minutes, one humming a song in his mind, while the other frowned, an arm crossed beneath her chest. Both had their heads deep inside the menu, their minds running 1,000 miles an hour as they tried to decide what to have. The options were too vast and plenty, and like the other gods that visited, Apollo was sure he had never seen such a wide variety of options before. It was like all the best hits over the years were in this one cafe, and each one was making his godly taste buds salivate with hunger. That wasn't the only thing making him salivate in hunger, although this was a different kind of hunger. He looked over his shoulder, and couldn't stop the grin when he noticed the nymph was looking at him from the corner of her eyes. Her petite hands idly picked up the strawberry sitting atop of her cake and proceeded to eat it in a way that would leave most men a drooling mess. Case in point, the red-faced satyr with a front seat view. Oh, man. She wants it. The god of the sun thought, trying not to be too blatantly obvious by his lust. For the goddess of love, she needed something of equal measure to the apple spice entremet she had last time. There was a couple of dishes that stood out, but nothing felt quite right. She needed something special to brag about to the other goddesses. Oh, she had heard from some of the gossiping nymphs around Olympus about the delightful treats and wonders Naruto had made that D-list goddess, Persephone. Having been turned away from the fox's den the last time she visited thanks to that annoying little daughter of Demeter, she got the full scoop and it made her itcher boil with jealousy. Eyes scanning over the delicacies, Aphrodite halted when she got to the selection of pies. If it was anywhere else, she would have found it strange that a cafe was serving pies of all things, but like the rest of her family, she expected nothing less from the over-the-top business with a dreamy delicious owner. A plan began to formulate in her mind, and a cat-like grin took over. It didn't take long for Naruto to return, a pair of breathtakingly gorgeous milkshakes being lowered onto the table. Like before, Aphrodite's eyes gleamed at the sight of the sweet treat, while Apollo couldn't help but gaze at the perfectly ratioed drink. The sweet smell of the hazelnut chocolate wafted around his nose, and the sun god couldn't help but bite his lip. He wanted a taste so bad. "Here's your milkshakes. I hope you enjoy," Naruto said, watching as Aphrodite's face lit up as the sweet taste engulfed her senses. Oh! It was as good as she remembered. In front of her, Apollo slipped into a similar state, ignorant of the chocolate mustache across the top of his lip. He could taste hazelnut chocolate, dark chocolate, white chocolate. It was an abundance of chocolate in a milkshake like he'd never tasted before. It was amazing. No wonder Artie loves this place. "So, have you thought about the rest of your order?" "We have," Aphrodite replied, and motioned for Apollo to go first. The god of the sun shrugged. He took one last quick peep from the menu, where one particular dish caught his eye numerous times. "Could I get a plate of the mochi, please?" That little nugget shined like a star in the night sky, his eyes always returning to the list of flavors provided. He loved the stuff, and he hadn't gorged himself on the Japanese delicacy in years. "Sure. What flavors would you like?" Apollo pondered for a moment, tapping his tongue against his cheek. "Could I get 3 of the coconut, 3 of the pineapple, and 3 of the green tea?" "Absolutely. Great choice," Naruto commended, before turning his head to Aphrodite, "and for the lady." Giggling, Aphrodite lowered the menu, slyly pushing out her chest and tempting the blonde to sneak a peek down her top. To increase her chances at tempting him, she lowered the strap to her top down to her shoulder, leaving her creamy skin to proudly bask in the sunlight. No mortal or immortal man could resist the temptation to look down a gorgeous woman's top. It was, as the mortals would say, just science. The goddess of love had no competition when it came to her girls. Sure, the other goddesses were decent enough, even Hestia when she wasn't hiding them behind all that brown fabric. However, they were no match for her, despite what they might claim. She was the most beautiful, and the most desired. She did receive the apple of discord from Paris after all. Fluttering her eyelashes, she bit the side of her lip. "I would love to have a piece of your salted caramel banana cream pie. It sounds to die for." Annoyingly for Aphrodite, the hunka blonde brought his notepad closer to his face, blocking out the beautiful view of her exquisite chest and therefore rendering him unaffected by her form. "Sure, I'll bring that out to you shortly." Another great choice. When he started walking away, Aphrodite scrunched up her face, and let out a loud huff. Damn it! Why was this so hard? Beneath the table, she kicked Apollo in the shin once more, startling the sun god while he was making googly eyes at the nymph. Ow! What did I do this time? Sorry, but this turning out to be more of a challenge than I thought. Her eyes became determined, but don't worry. I have a plan to lure him in, and it's sure to work. The blonde-haired god shook his head. Sure, deity. Whatever you say. He replied, before returning to stare and make gestures at the nymph. He brought up his hands, and with one hand made an O shape, while the other flexed his index finger. Grinning, Apollo began thrusting the finger through the hole and motioned with his head to the restrooms across the room. As great as the milkshake was, the sun god only had one thing on his mind right now. Unbeknownst to the pair of Olympians, Aphrodite's attempts had not been a complete failure. Good job, Naruto. You didn't look down. You get a pat on the shoulder later, he thought, trying to control the blush on his cheeks. That woman, he couldn't deny how beautiful she was and how difficult it was being around her. It was like he hated to say it, but his libido was getting supercharged. Bringing the notebook up to his face to hide her cleavage had been a swift idea, and tried to rotate his eyes between the notepad and her eyes. Those beautiful, soul-crushing. Damn it. Stop thinking about it. Pushing those thoughts away, he went to the back and readied their order. Falling back in her chair, Aphrodite did nothing but watch the people in the room. There were a couple of men and women that took her fancy. The couple sitting a few tables away from her, in particular, looked her type. On any other day, she would have walked straight over and threw some fancy words their way and taken them both away with her. Today though, she was intent on wrapping the hunka blonde up in her arms and legs. Maybe she needed to kiss him again? Add a little tongue this time. Humming to herself, she didn't appear interested when the nymph making googly eyes with Apollo got up from her table and walked past their table. Her finger ran across the sun god's shoulder and whispered something in his ears. A coy grin appeared on her face, before making her way to the restroom, swaying her hips in a way that hypnotized the Olympian. After a minute passed, Apollo jumped up from his seat. Bathroom break. Be back in 10, no, 15 minutes. Sure honey. Enjoy. Aphrodite waved her hand and idly watched as Apollo walked across the room and slipped into the restroom. The last thing she heard as the door closed was the sound of a high-pitched giggle and a bark of laughter from the younger Olympian. From across the room, the satyr slumped his shoulders and left some money on the table before getting up and leaving. Today had been a bust on a godly level. 5 minutes later, as she sipped on her milkshake, Naruto appeared next to her table, a tray in his hand and his ever-present smile on his face. Oh, she was loving that smile. How could she resist? He motioned to the empty on the table. Where did your friend go? The restroom. I guess he couldn't hold it in. She shrugged and licked her lips as Naruto lowered Apollo's order of the mochi. Admittedly, the goddess of love had never tried mochi before, but Apollo had told her all about it. Normally, Eastern food didn't do much for her, which led to the Olympian rarely visiting the Far East. Unlike other gods who enjoyed traversing through the world and tiptoeing around the other pantheons, she preferred sticking to what she knew. However, Aphrodite had to admit, the mochi's vibrant colors were catching her attention. If I have to guess, the white ones are the coconut flavor. She asked, and looked pleased with herself when Naruto nodded, which means the yellow ones are the pineapple and the green ones are the green tea. Good eye. Thank you. I've never had mochi before, though maybe I should try it sometime. I love the colors, and I've never tried Eastern food much. Well, except for my favorite Chinese takeout. She giggled. Really? Well, next time you visit I'll point out some Eastern dishes from the menu, and you could try them. I would like that a lot. Her eyes drifted to the remaining plate on the tray. For me. Nodding, Naruto lowered the dish and presented the goddess with her order, 1 salted caramel banana cream pie. The goddess of love's eyes lit up with glee. The dessert looked positively scrumptious and perfectly proportioned. A layer of salted caramel was drizzled on the top of the cream, to which Aphrodite could smell tickling her nose. Licking her lips again, Aphrodite took her fork and slices of a small piece before bringing it up to her mouth. A moan of delight erupted from her throat, her eyes closing as she took in the taste. Gods, it tasted good. How the mortal did it, she didn't know. It was like he had the golden hands of the gods when it came to all things pastries and desserts. It was as if Hestia or Hera, or gods forbid, Rhea had blessed him with their culinary talents. She racked her brain on the possibilities. You like? What a silly question. Was the moan not sufficient enough? Dite quipped, taking another bite and releasing a similar response. Seriously? How did he do it? It was mind-boggling. Smiling, Naruto gave a short bow. I'm glad you like it, mademoiselle. Giggling, Aphrodite noticed him beginning to turn away and put her plan into action. Digging her fork into her pie, she brought it up to her mouth looking ready to bite down. Instead, she tilted the fork and watched as the piece slid off the fork. Oh no! How clumsy of me! Blinking in surprise, Naruto turned back. Huh! He let out before his eye traveled down and pinpointing where the piece of pie landed. Instantly, his eyes widened and his cheeks gained a healthy rosy tint to them. As planned, the piece of Aphrodite's pie landed in the space between her breasts, slavering cream and crumbs across her skin and drew the attention of all the men in the room. Oh! Instantly, he grabbed some napkins and held them out for Aphrodite to take, while having the decency to look away. Here, use these to clean yourself up. How kind. Thank you, she replied, though her efforts didn't stop there. Oh no, I think it's gone in my bra. Wait one moment while I fish it out. Delving down, her petite hands disappeared down her top, ensuring that she exposed some extra skin while she fished for the piece of the pie. She could see his will weakening when his eyes kept trying to sneak a peek, though he would look away a moment later. That wouldn't do. Not at all. Excuse me one moment. She turned around and leaned down, jimmying the piece out from her top and hearing it dropping to the floor. At the same time, she heard an array of breaths being sucked in, including one from the person she was hoping to hear. When she turned around, she made sure the lacy little number she was wearing beneath her pants was visible for all to see. Not enough to be distasteful, but enough for everyone's imaginations to run wild. It never failed in getting the blood pumping. There it is, she muttered, a coy grin on her face, before masking it into a smile. She looked up at Naruto with a palm resting against her cheek. What a klutz I can be. That's okay. The blonde shinobi desperately wanted to get back to his other customers. I'm going to get back to work. Spalt. The blonde shinobi blinked in surprise once more and felt something impact his groin area. Looking down, Naruto found himself staring at the cream and crumb-stained remains of a piece of the banana cream pie covering his pants. He threw his hands up, his mouth forming an O shape as he incredulously stared at Aphrodite. What was that for? Not giving anything away, she feigned shock and grabbed one of the napkins handed to her moments ago. Oh no! Look what I've done! I'm so clumsy today! A gleam was in her eyes and leaned forward in her chair. Before Naruto could do or say anything, he found a hand rubbing the napkin over his pants, swatting away the remnants of Aphrodite's desert. Here, let me get that for you. Oh God! A choked gasp came out of Naruto's mouth and the blonde found himself breathing through his nose significantly harder than before. Around the room, jaws dropped at the action, with the men cursing the blonde's luck. He tried to put a stop to it but found his hands getting swatted away by the beautiful woman, and felt her efforts hasten twice-fold. What the hell? He thought, trying not to feel any sense of pleasure from what he was experiencing. He could have sworn her swipes were becoming longer and more drawn out. What is with this woman? He was too shocked by her actions to move. He'd never met a woman who was this bold before. You really don't need to do this. Don't be silly. It's the least I can do. I can do it myself. Hold still. He tried to backtrack, but Aphrodite's other hand grabbed one of his pockets and held on. Around the room, everyone could only watch in disbelief at the show in front of them. For the customers that Naruto had his back to, it looked like the love goddess was doing something much more intimate and steamy. Their faces were red like tomatoes. After a moment passed, the bickering between Naruto and Aphrodite came to a halt with the Olympian looking up at him with a beaming smile. There we go. All clean. The goddess of love threw the napkin to the side and put her hands together in front of her. I'm sorry for being such a nuisance. Is there anything I can do to make it up to you? Pushing her cleavage together, Naruto once again found himself fighting to keep his eyes focused on her face. He wasn't a pervert. He would not give in. In Aphrodite's mind, the opposite was going through her mind. Give in. Give in. Give in. Bump. Huh. Both Naruto and Aphrodite blinked at the sound. It sounded like something impacting one of the walls. What was that? Naruto asked, his face turning into a frown. Did that come from the bathroom? No, don't be silly. Aphrodite chittered away, her gaze going between Naruto and the door that led to the restrooms. It's probably nothing. She put her hands together, and beamed up at him. Why don't you pull up a chair and we could talk? Wouldn't that be nice? Then I can kick my shoe off and run my foot up the inside of your leg. She thought. Thank goodness she had that pedicure this morning. Bump. There it is again. What is that? he asked, his frown deepening. Come to think of it, your friend still isn't back. Do you think everything's okay? Bump. 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 Okay, I'll be right back. Surging forward, the blonde shinobi unknowingly dodged the oncoming hand of Aphrodite, the goddess of love, trying to prevent him from leaving. No. 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 Her face scrunched up, and resembling a child, began to kick her feet against the air. Why did something have to keep getting in her way? She had an idea of what was creating that sound and knew the moment Naruto went inside, trouble was about to brew. She just needed a little more time to get her man. She could feel his will weakening. She was so close. This isn't fair. She was not hanging around and getting blamed for Apollo's actions. She couldn't afford to get kicked out or worse, banned for life for being associated with the idiot sun god. Don't get her wrong, she loved a bit of public voyeurism, and how kinky and exciting it could be. The number of times she and Ares had relations while the other gods were around was uncountable. Hell, the number of times they'd done it in Hera's sacred garden while the queen was tending to her lotuses was in the hundreds. Don't even get her started on the number of times they snuck into the other temples of her Olympian family and made use of the beds. The unspoken rule of not going in the temples of other Olympians largely went unnoticed with them. Silently standing up, Aphrodite shoveled the rest of her dessert into her mouth as quickly as she could, groaning in delight as her taste buds got supercharged. Oh God, it's so good. She followed up by picking up her milkshake, hoping the hunky owner didn't mind one of his glasses going missing. Before making a beeline for the door, she glanced at Apollo's side of the table and noticed his milkshake was still half full and his mochi was untouched. Making an executive decision, Aphrodite conjured a small Tupperware box and poured the mochi inside. It was Apollo's loss for getting distracted, unlike herself. At least she knew to keep her eyes on the prize. She'd keep his dessert as a treat for herself later on. This isn't over, my hunka blonde chef, she thought. She had plenty of tricks up her sleeve she could call on and would be calling on them to reel Naruto in. Picking up Apollo's chocolate milkshake, she snuck out through the front door just as Naruto entered the restroom and disappeared behind the door. The last thing Aphrodite heard as she disappeared down the street, 2 straws in her mouth as her taste buds overloaded with delicious strawberry and chocolate goodness, was a loud yell and a scream courtesy of the sun god. It didn't take long for chaos to erupt as a half-dressed nymph ran out from the restroom, a shoe missing and her arm wrapped around her chest. She didn't dare look anyone in the eye and took off out the building in embarrassment. Moments later, the 2 blondes came stumbling out of the restroom, one with a look of fury on his face, while the other wore a sheepish expression. Everyone in the room either blushed or looked away when they noticed Apollo wasn't wearing any pants and was pitching a noticeable bulge. His shirt was missing too, lost in the chaos that erupted moments earlier. Ow! 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 Apollo's whined. His right arm was extended in the air, his wrist trapped in a vice grip courtesy of the blonde owner. Damn it! Why was this guy so strong? It was like being manhandled by his sister. Get out! Get out! Get out! Naruto repeated, walking Apollo out of the fox's den and pushing him into the street. Don't ever come back. This is not that kind of establishment. Wah! But dash. No buts. Naruto slammed the door shut behind Apollo, leaving the sun god half naked in the middle of New York, his jaw dropping. He just got banned from ever stepping inside the fox's den. The place that created food that left members of his Olympian family a moaning mess was now out of his reach, all because he couldn't control the thing between his legs. This was a nightmare. His hands grabbed his face. What have I done? That's it for part 3. Thank you for watching and see you on the next video.